what that meant to say. We have really
what that meant to say.
Yeah.
We have really what that meant to say.
I'm echoing too.
I'm not.
Right. Sorry,
I just double checked.
That's because it forced me to put the Twitch thing in to start live streaming. So then I had Twitch open. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we finally get started with our first SASA monthly book club, which has a live Ask the Author, which our book club for September was When Women Ruled the World by Dr. Kara Cooney, who is next to me over here. So that's why I always point. And yes, she perfectly has the book. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our live event. I'm sure people are probably just starting to click on it now, or maybe you were already waiting for us. So thank you for being here. I will just say some really quick things about SASA. Go to our website, saveancientstudies.org, and become a member. Check out the events page to RSVP to other live events like this one. You also don't have to RSVP. You can just watch the live stream on Facebook, Zoom, and Twitch, except for Archeo Gaming will only be on Twitch. But besides that, I think we can just jump into things, and I'm going to hand it over to lovely Dr. Christian Casey, the Egyptologist, and Dr. Kara Cooney.
Okay, well, thanks for that introduction. Lovely is not necessarily the adjective I would use to describe myself. I am an Egyptologist, so I recently finished my PhD at Brown in Egyptology, specializing in Egyptian language. And right now I'm a postdoc at ISAW, and I've been working a lot with SASA. ISAW is the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. It's an institute that's part of NYU, and that's how I, got connected with SASA and all the work that David is doing. So we've been doing a few of these different things. Last week we did Archeo Gaming, and this week we are interviewing, or really just kind of having a friendly conversation with Egyptologist Dr. Kara Cooney, who is going to tell us about her book. So I'll turn it over to her, not spend any more time talking about myself. So Kara, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about your book?
Sure thing. My name's Kara Cooney, and I am a professor at UCLA, and I'm also chair there of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. I am a social historian. My specialization, I've realized, is power. Power systems, power and gender. I'm writing a new book right now for Nat Geo books about authoritarianism, which has become more political than one could ever imagine, or maybe you can imagine it because nothing is non-political these days. So even Ramses II is a political, my take on Ramses II is quite political. So the way I describe myself to people and my career is a very schizophrenic one. On the one hand, I have my academic self. I guide graduate students through PhDs. I teach graduate and undergraduate classes. And my research in the Egyptological sphere deals with coffins and the power of display and showing off wealth of the family. And that moves from the 19th dynasty all the way to the early 22nd. And I'm obsessed, as everyone knows, with reuse and how people will find a way to display even if they can't get access to materials they can use from scratch. So if they have to use a coffin that somebody else had been buried in, they will do so. So that's one side of myself. And then the other side is the popularizer, if you like, the part of, and I publish under two different names. So that previous iteration of myself is Kathleen M. Cooney. And this version of myself, the popularizer, is Kara Cooney, though that's what everyone calls me. And as Kara Cooney, I publish trade books and do TV shows, though I don't do TV shows anymore, thank God. But the trade books are a way for me to make the ancient world relevant and to keep on this topic of power. And this book, When Women Ruled the World, was pitched to me by Nat Geo. I had a completely different idea in mind. And like, why don't you write this about different queens? And I'm like, I think I could, but we should call them female kings. And it became a dissertation, if you like, on female power and a tragedy as well. So as I was writing the book, I would have my editor say, and this is not Hillary Black, a different editor, say, well, you know, this is really depressing. There should be some sort of hope in here. And I'm like, no, every one of these women is a placeholder for the patriarchy. And I'm going to tell it the way I see it. And so it was hard to, sometimes I can be a bit cynical or hard in my estimations of power in the world. But
that's the play of the title, right?
Yes, so it's meant to be sly, right? So and I'm going to put the book down so I don't keep grabbing it like a game show host. But I'm trying to pull you in. When women ruled the world, they did rule the world, and we have treated it as revisionist history, and yet they really didn't in the long term, and they are just placeholders for another man to take their place. So, but yeah, go ahead, Christian. What do you?
No, that was exactly what I wanted to draw out, is that there's a deep irony to the title that you would never know if you didn't pick up and read the book, which is women were ruling the world, but very temporarily and for very specific reasons, totally dependent on that historical context. And that is probably not what people were expecting when they see that title.
No, and it's something that when I'm teaching my class at UCLA, Women in Power in the Ancient World, I get a lot of pushback for. And I get pushback specifically, and I'm going to get intersectional here, I get pushback from a specific white female entitled audience. How dare you say that we don't have the power that we think we have? How dare you say that we have so much more fighting to do? And, you know, I'll say, look, I've had the baby. I've worked through the interview process. I know a little bit more than you. If you think you have all the power, that's fine. I thought I did too at your age. And I thought feminism was something I didn't need either. And then we have this discussion. It's interesting when that discussion comes up in my class, that the young women who speak up countering that opinion are women of color, who are like, I'm sorry, wait a minute. No, we have so much longer, so much harder to fight. And women don't have any power at all. And let me explain A, B, and C. And then it becomes a little bit more real for those white young females, how much they ride the coattails of a male white patriarchy in this society. And so I would assume the same for an ancient Egyptian society, that's why I don't like the category of women. It's a stupid category. Are you young? Are you old? Are you beautiful and hot? Are you a villager? Are you educated? Are you royal blood or not? And all of those things will determine what your power could potentially be. And there will be entitlements and there will be non-entitlements. And all of those issues of power are the kinds of things I like to play with in my work.
Right. If you just facet, like, according to that one demographic category, are you male or female, there will be such a huge variation among the situations of the different women that it almost doesn't even make any sense to try to group them and describe them as one thing anymore.
And that's why I created the class first before the book. Because so much this is about ancient world education, right? So much of ancient world education in universities around the United States in particular is women in Greece, women in ancient Rome, women in ancient Egypt. And then you discuss, you know, what does it mean to be a woman, and gender studies. And it's like, where's the woman? Where's Waldo? And you find the woman, and there's your women's history. And I was frustrated with that approach, because we either implicitly went towards the women with power and just categorized them as women in the same way that the Egyptologist Jan Osman looks at funerary arts of the rich and categorizes it as all funerary religion. So we either did that, or we didn't understand that there were different ways of understanding the hearth and the home, or understanding a goddess of hearth and home and women having domestic duties. It doesn't really help me to understand a woman's place in society. And so once I focused in on power and made it about women and power in the ancient world, and that is the title of my class at UCLA, then I was able to key into some really interesting questions that were more, just really kept me going. And then I ended up writing that book because of it.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you sort of pulled that thread, because, you know, my personal impression reading the book is that the goal is really to pull out these different moments where women had, you know, were the top of the power hierarchy in ancient Egypt. And by specifically looking for that thing, you end up finding a lot of things that you weren't expecting. For instance, the fact that you've already mentioned, the fact that they were sort of acting as placeholders for dynasties that were in decline, and the need to, you know, find the direct heir in order to maintain some amount of legitimacy. But then there's this other crisis of legitimacy that comes from the fact that this is a female ruler, kind of seeing the optimization of like hereditary versus like these gender norms that are used for propagandistic purposes and things.
It's crazy.
Would not have expected that.
To see how much female power is associated with incest and dynastic connection. And then to see the kinds of, so that's one pattern that I was like, oh yeah, I of course I see that now. But if you compare to the 19th dynasty, 20th dynasty, where you don't see as much incest, you also don't see as much female royal power. Yes, the harem killed the king, but the woman is not even named. She doesn't get any power from it. And it's again, being used as pawns and tokens. But it also enabled me to see other patterns, like interesting things like Mubarak's Egypt, where Suzanne Mubarak was empowered. It's a dynasty. His sons were going to be empowered. And that's the way family dynasties work. And when that was swept aside by a military system, more of a Ramesside system, the women have no place. And it's interesting to see Sisi having to get really, he knows that it looks like a man's world. And now his ministers, I think, are 8 out of 33 are women. That was last I checked. I'll have to look. And there is a concerted attempt on his part to move a man aside, move a woman in, so that you can see there's female representation. But again, I'm not, you know, none of this power in my mind, it makes it very clear, these women, these Egyptian women make it very clear that it's not about the gender of the person occupying the post. It's still about the system of power itself and whom it serves. And there are many today that speak up for this patriarchy.
Yeah, in the case you just described, where El-Sisi is specifically like trying to bring women in, that still begs the question of like, who is really in charge? Because if women only obtain power when a dominant man says, we need more women here, well, then they're not really obtaining power, are they? They're being put into a position.
One of my great examples for that is the United States military, which in every branch of the armed forces, except for the Marines, because Marines have their own culture, females have taken over officer positions and are approaching 25% of officer positions. It's not 50%, but it's pretty close. And the only reason that works is because there's an authoritarian there's somebody at the top, some general who's like, this works for us, make it so. And it is coming down from the top. People can't be like, but we don't want a woman to tell us what to do. It's gonna happen. And so then you realize as well that within a patriarchal system, that it has to be foisted upon people, this female power. Otherwise, if there's an organic system, they will not choose it. And that's what you see in the economic system in the United States, where female CEOs number about 6-7% in the single digits. And there's no one up top saying, you know, women are good leaders, women have nuance, women are able to think in a different way. And that's an arguable point. But it's...
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was kind of hoping to, we have a question here, but I'll eventually come back to that, because I think you ask a really interesting question with that, which is, do women on average rule differently? And what does that mean? Like, what are the implications of that idea? So I'll try to come back to it, but
yes.
Sorry to
sort of cut that.
Yeah.
Thing. So we can come back when you want. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Carly Silver that says, the supposed smoothness of Egyptian succession / prioritizing others over self don't vibe with archaeological record and human nature. Would you speak to that?
The archaeological nature of human nature, I think Carly is saying that things are more competitive, and how do we see something that's so smooth and clean? I love that question. It's very much what the Egyptian divine kingship is trying to set up for us. Note that we don't know how the next king is chosen. We really have no idea. Is it primogeniture? Maybe in the Ramesside period. Was it in the 18th dynasty? Probably not, because a lot of young guys are getting chosen as king and probably passing over older brothers. Does it occur with the god's consent, or it's like a bunch of priests holding the oracle and they decide? It seems so in the 18th dynasty. How does it occur at other times? We have no idea. And that is exactly how the Egyptians wanted it to be. Right. So all of that realpolitik is happening behind the curtain, nothing to see here. And what is presented to the mid and lower level elite, the rest of the peasantry doesn't matter, but the mid and lower level elite see a smooth and perfected transition and no problematic coups or competition of any kind. And I would add to this that Egypt is different from the worlds of antiquity that we are also exposed to, and that would be Greece and Rome, West Asia, Babylonia, Syria, Persia, places that don't have the geographic protection and that don't have the agricultural wealth have more competition. So if you're dealing with a rain-fed agriculture, you're going to have a more hard scrabble politics, one could argue, just geographically, not determined, but geographically led. And having a shit ton of grain is really useful for keeping a smooth transition and everyone really happy about the status quo. And one could argue that modern Egypt still has a shit ton of water. And so, and that's a debate with all of the dams going up and all of these things, but that cheap electricity and cheap water has allowed a large population and allowed a population to not have to be in constant competition with one another. So Egypt is a different, less competitive place until the Iron Age, and then all bets are off when those empires can go on the move. But
well, yeah, when you can.
Yeah, and when you can move an army of tens
Exactly.
of thousands across a desert and figure out how to do that, Egypt is toast. But
Right.
before that, in the Bronze Age, it's this protected bubble unto itself that is the only place in this ancient world that creates a divine kingship par excellence. No one else is able to do that. Even, Hammurabi rules like what? How many years? Like 10, 15? It's not my area, but it's not long.
Person to ask.
It's not long. And if you look at Mari and Zimri Lim, 10 years? And then he's taken out by Hammurabi. I mean, these guys, emperors in Rome, good luck ruling for, longer than 10 years. This is a really hard scrabble competitive existence. Egypt doesn't have that problem, which is kind of cool to see as well. So
yeah,
there are many, the answer to Carly's question is there are many answers to your question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you could even argue that Egyptologists haven't fully wrestled with that question, because you'll even see Egyptologists trying to understand like what was happening in this scenario. And it's like, well, there was not a smooth transition of power. That's exactly what was happening.
Well, this is one of my favorite things to do, Christian. So Egyptologists, in my opinion, generally drink the Kool-Aid and like to take the record as given as fact. And when I don't, I have been accused of being hypothetical to a fault and questioning the evidence and using non-evidence. But in my opinion, when an authoritarian regime presents evidence, you better look at it askance. You better look at it with an oblique lens and try to figure out why they're telling you what they're telling you and what it could indeed be hiding. And all of us, we Egyptologists love these statues. We love these kings. We love our Egyptians, so much so that we become apologists for the way that they rule. And we don't see it as an authoritarian regime. And that's the kind of thing that I'd like to mess with.
Yeah, it's great. I've had that argument before too. Politely, I mean, argument, debate.
Yeah.
But like the thing, so, in the story of Sinuhe, there's so many questions about like, why did Sinuhe run away? And there are maybe 100 papers written about that. And it's like, he ran away because he thought there was going to be violence.
And he's in the harem, right?
Right.
He's working for the harem at that point. And the harem, as we know, for Dynasty 6, for Dynasty 20, is so often a touch point to get to the actual king's body. It is the only means for some people to get close to the physicality of the king and do him harm. And maybe something happened in the harem and he's like, holy shit, the king is dead. He's gotta run. Something's up, something's going on.
It doesn't match what they try to tell us about themselves too. So it's confusing, but
I wrote a lot about Senwosret I for this last book. And I'm like, wow, only one guy thinks that there was not a co-regency. Only one guy, and I can't remember French. I can't remember his name. I'll have to look it up. I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember his name. But most people are like, oh no, this co-regency totally worked. And Senwosret I says that he's got to run home and fight against competitors. In Amenemhet I's instruction, it says, I didn't set it up, I didn't tell
Yeah.
anyone. It wasn't prepared. Senwosret the first races home. Why is he racing if he doesn't have to fight against brothers to get his throne? When you've gotten that throne, doesn't it make sense then to say, oh yeah, like Hatshepsut, like Tutmos III would claim, oh, I was meant to be king all along. My father marked me while I was a child. And then you claim a fictitious, what's the word? Fictitious kingship, co-kingship that never really existed. And that's followed throughout the Middle Kingdom as a propaganda of power, in my opinion. Can't prove it, but how are you going to?
Well, yeah, I think proving, yeah, but there's a whole topic there, but like the desire to prove things is maybe not applicable to when you're talking about super ancient history. Anyway, I'm going to bring up another question that we got from viewer. So what do you think about people assuming that royal women in ancient Egypt had more power than royal women in other contemporary ancient cultures, or more equality? Do you think this is because of the nature of the evidence, that we have more evidence for royal women? Or is this connected to the misconception that Egypt was unique?
This is the question of my class. And it's a question that I ask again each time I teach it. And it's not an easy answer. But what I will say is that while on the one hand, Egypt allowed women more unadulterated and formal power than any other place in the ancient world except for China, that doesn't mean that those women were able to have any legacy of power, any sort of matriarchy or feminist system. So, but I will also say that within that system, they gained that power through an authoritarianism, through an extraordinarily unequal society. And I would argue, and this is also a bit inflammatory, but I think it fits, that in places where there's less land ownership, and I think we can mostly agree with the land documents that we have, that a few institutions and a few wealthy landowners pulled the strings of the Egyptian economy, and that there was less competition amongst small landholders, at least until late iron. Most of the landowners, be a temple or a king or a combination of both, maybe some big landowners in Dynasty 12 or something like that. But with few landowners, a man doesn't need to worry about his lineage as much because he's just a sharecropper. The poor don't have to worry about marriage in the same way that the middle class have to worry about marriage or lineage or controlling the womb. The other thing you don't get in Egypt, which is super interesting, is you don't get virginity tests. You don't get women getting stoned for having premarital sex. They don't even talk about premarital sex. Instead, you see people kind of shacking up and then they shack up with somebody else. And what that means for me, as somebody who believes that the economy drives so much of power and so much of society, means that the economic stakes are lower for the female or for the entire family if there's sex and free love and premarital this or that, and people try things out and there's divorces. It's not as devastating economically as it would be in the Levant, as it would be in Greece, as it would be even in Rome or Mesopotamia. And there the crackdown is extraordinary because the economic results on the family are extraordinary. You can say the same for India. You can say the same for China, where the extended family demands a control of the woman economically as a baby-making producer. And if you don't have that controlled and marked and stamped and branded, then your entire family is devastated. Egypt, I think, has less of that because of the way land is owned.
And even going back to what you said before about it being kind of a bubble, people can't invade, but people who are there also can't just leave if they want to.
Yeah, and that's Carnero's conscription theory, right? That you're stuck in that place and it makes the kingship that much more powerful over the people. And it's so interesting the way it affords so much less power for the 80% or 90% of the population. And yet at the same time, it affords more social power for sexual freedom and women's ownership rights of property, bringing it into a divorce or getting a divorce, or even the institution of marriage at all. The Egyptians are not all about the institution of marriage. We're like, yeah, there's no ceremony, it's just an economic thing. But that means that the economics and the authoritarianism is the same reason you get so many female kings, is the same reason as you get so much female power lower down in society. It's kind of a dirty, tragic reasoning, though.
Yeah. And it does sort of emphasize what you said, that it's not feminism, right? It's not this theological belief in the equality of the sexes. It's coming about through a very different means.
Yeah.
Quite a few. We're getting quite a lot of questions, so I'm just going to jump into another one. Why do you think it is that there are not more female leaders today in higher up roles, such as CEO or president of a company? Does this have to do with how the Egyptian women ruled back then?
So I think this is a question I've not solved. I don't think any of us have truly solved. It's something that I think about on a daily basis. I think that in a patriarchal society, when we are given an organic choice to choose in a direct election, like we do in the United States, electoral college aside, we tend to choose men and are frightened to choose women. And I would encourage you to look at those state systems that have voted for female leaders. They're all parliamentary. That means that they vote for their representatives who then vote for that female leader. It is not a direct election. And only then do you get those females in charge. I don't know of a female who was ever put into office as leader of state in a direct election. And what are the shareholders of a Fortune 500 company than a direct electorate to decide whom they want and whom they don't want? And there you come to the crux of an issue. Well, what's wrong with women? And this is a tricky one. And here I start to hedge and hem and haw because I'm not sure myself. And I feel like there needs to be some evolutionary biology brought into this. I think our perspectives on female emotionality, whether it's held by a male or a female, are very conflicted. And I think when we are afraid or threatened, we tend to feel safe, we, the human mammal, choosing a decisive power that we think will keep us safe. And that is why we so often turn towards authoritarianism, and why increasingly today, in this time of climate change and upheaval, people are willingly turning towards authoritarianism in this country and in many other countries as well. So that's a big question. So
I think you are
life's work, I think. So, yeah.
Oh, easily. It's one of those questions that we may never really answer, but you are touching upon this idea of there's a correlation between like male leadership and authoritarianism. And, there aren't very many authoritarian women.
No.
Doesn't really happen. So there's definitely a correlation there, whether it exists in biology and in our personalities, or whether it's just something that we perceive. That correlation certainly exists. Can
I follow up on the biological point? Because
sure.
It's a third rail, and I love to touch third rails. But the evolutionary biology quotient of this is important, and it's something that feminism within humanities avoids and actually eschews. You're not supposed to talk about evolutionary biology as determining anything. And here's my setup for this. We've created the binary. The binary is not actual humankind. And I just listened to this great podcast that talked about all humans being queer because we lack this gene that the rest of lower mammals have that gives a strong masculine dominance to our species. And that gene exists in mice and it exists in rats, but it doesn't exist in humans. So humans are all a little bit queer, which is interesting and creates a cool perspective of our social species and how we evolved to be something that is not male or female in its binary form. And other mammals are more binary than we are. But as we enter into the agricultural revolution and we figure out how to survive in those economic models, a binary is very useful for us. So we recreate it culturally. You're either male, you're either female. If you don't fit, we will punish you into it and make you fit, right? As we leave those agricultural economic models, we see more freedom. Gay marriage, you can be transgender, you can be a male who's a little bit female or a female who's a little bit male. And at UCLA, you can tick all these boxes of what your sexual orientation is, and it can be very complicated because it's reflecting the human biological reality, which is complicated. So given all of that, we've created the binary. And within that binary, we, I think as a human species, distrust that feminine nuance. But that feminine nuance is also an incredibly powerful takedown of women in society. And just let me give one example. So, and I've had one child who had changed my ideas of feminism forever after, because it was the most difficult thing I've ever done. And I love my kid dearly, but he's not an easy child. And the birth wasn't easy. Everything after it wasn't easy. He's a high needs, lovely, wonderful child. But this idea of biology driving things, in my office at UCLA, I can sit in my office and there'll be a male colleague next to me, and I can see the students coming to my office more than coming to my colleague's office, my male white colleague's office. Maybe he gives off a vibe of, I don't want to talk to you. Maybe he gives off a vibe of big, strong male. I give off a different vibe, apparently. Is that in my pheromones? I don't know. Is it something it seems to be a biological drive, and I know many of my female colleagues know exactly what I'm talking about, which means that we in the workplace end up doing more service and end up doing more hand-holding of students and end up having the Kleenex box nearby for the students who are crying than my male colleagues do, who are just like, oh my God, I don't ever deal with that stuff. Oh, look, another article. And and I would say that that's not, you can't just say, oh, it's because you're nicer than I am. Though the male colleague will often say, oh, you're too nice and you shouldn't do that. I think it's partly biologically driven, that I am seen as the nurturer, I'm seen as the caretaker biologically, and I am a mother. And so then they'll come to my office with a different expectation. And if we don't talk about the evolutionary biology of what it does to women in the workplace, and if we don't talk about these things, that everyone is misogynist in the same way that everyone is sexist, that in the same way that everyone is racist, then I don't think that we can transcend any of these things. So
if we say that they are, or if we don't say that they are.
So let me say that again, because I fumbled that. There are cognitive studies that prove the human species is inherently racist, that you can show a baby certain colors and they'll want to look at the colors of the people that are bringing them up. And they are more attracted to them and more afraid of the other facial colors. Right. So there is an inherent wired racism. But if we talk about it and discuss it, this is something that can be transcended. And I would argue it's the same with misogyny. I think there is part of the human species that is wired to see the male power as something that is dominant and safe. And that if we don't talk about that, then we will never be able to transcend it and start to choose female leaders who don't have their finger on that red button quite as with hard a push as the men do. And if people are like, oh no, you can't say this is biologically driven, I'll be like, okay, who commits the most rapes? Who starts the most wars? Who's the most violent in society? Who fills the most prisons? And then we have another answer. And so.
And a lot more questions too. People can.
Yeah, this is dangerous territory though. People are like, don't tell me what I am biologically. And I'm like, if we don't talk about it, then that's a huge, it's a mistake.
Well, at the point that like everyone is capable of any sort of bigotry, I try to say that all the time. And I always try to put myself out there to say like, I am capable of being a racist. I'm capable of being a sexist. I have thought things that I'm not proud of before. And the only way that we as a society are ever going to deal with these things is acknowledge that this is a natural thing to do, just like any other temptation, and that it has to be specifically identified and resisted. I think that's super important for our time.
Yeah. And that's our Ibram Kendi anti-racism. You can't say I don't have a racist bone in my body, like Joe Biden said. Instead, we all have to embrace that we can all do better, and it's there for everyone. I totally agree.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, like big stuff too. Big important topics. I'm gonna bring us back down a little bit because I'm getting a lot of really good questions that are sort of more specific. Okay. So I think the one I'm looking at right now, Rebecca Summers, I think we've addressed your question, so I'm going to skip to the next one. Carly asks, do the Ptolemaic tax records and bills of sale conducted by women reflect an Egyptian legacy of unique attitudes to women?
I would never say unique because that's scary. And Ptolemaic, it's not my jam, so I can't really, while I deal with ancient economics, I don't deal with ancient Ptolemaic economics. What I can say is that things get much more competitive and there's more small landholding at that time period. But the Egyptians and those who do deal with economic landholdings know that incest starts to move within to normal families, not just the royal family, as a means of keeping money in the family, so much so that you have brother-sister marriages and all kinds of cousin marriages, and this is still a thing in Egypt.
Cousin marriages are...
He is married to his cousin, right? This is a normal thing. So it's, you know, Egypt is still of course, Egypt is unique. It's not fair for me to say it's not. Every place is unique and every place can be dealt with in its particulars. And this strange giant oasis in Northeast Africa that would have been a desert if it weren't for the Nile carving through it, it is a bizarre place. Everything I think that is economic in Egypt must start with that as its foundation. How that changes through time for the Ptolemaic period is arguable, and I'd have to think about it more. So there's a research project for you to do.
Yeah, that's a great
good one. Is
Wait,
it really?
For me? Do I have to do it? Because I
mean, who asked the question? Who was it? Because that's a dissertation right there.
That was Carly Silver. Yeah, that's a great question, Carly. Aden Marin asks, do you think that the reason women in ancient Egypt had more rights, such as the right to own property, was because of the various goddesses they adored?
Yeah, this is something my students ask all the time. They're like, oh, the religion is going to dictate the culture. And I say, au contraire. And let us look at all kinds of places where that doesn't work. For example, the goddess Athena in Greece, or Demeter, you have these extraordinarily powerful females who are warlike and able to really, you know, mow down opposing armies or create discord if they want. But that doesn't mean that in Greece, the woman didn't have to leave the house veiled and have a male accompaniment like in current day Afghanistan. I mean, that was the reality. And notice that those goddesses are often demanded to be virgins, particularly the warlike ones. The ones with the more masculine type ability to think don't have families or husbands in general. So there's all kinds of trades that a female has to give, in the same way a Vestal Virgin, to get that power, has to make the trade of family and home life, the same way an abbess would have had to do in medieval Europe. And you can also look at other places like ancient India and look at Kali or Durga, and you see these, there it's a very good comparison to Mut and Sekhmet, that divinity that is there as a bloodthirsty counterpoint of male aggression, which has a male aggression which violently takes without any care to what is right and what is good. And that female can go out and destroy those males who are not behaving according to the prescribed system of morality. But in each and every case, whether it's Sekhmet or the Eye of Re or Kali or Durga, those women are acting on behalf of the patriarchy. So those fiercest of divinities are generally there to support a more authoritarian system. And this does not trickle down into regular society the way you would think it does. And here it gets really interesting for me, because these divinities, one would think, pre-existed agriculture, right? Divinity is something that it develops over time in a spirit world kind of way, in concert with the geography that we live in. And then once the agricultural revolution hits, whenever it hits in certain places, those divinities are going to be brought in and transformed to fit that new economy. And so those female goddesses, which had a different place in a hunter-gatherer existence, I would expect, then have to be, those strong females then have to be brought to protect the ruling male group, and have to keep the female down in a sense. And it's extraordinary to see the way people have been able to do that in different parts of the world. And don't forget, the agricultural revolution is quite recent, in Egypt included, you know, only what, 7,000 years old at the earliest? Though we might push that back, but that's not.
Yeah, but it's in that ballpark. So it's not, you know, some of these divinities could be tens of thousands of years old.
Oh yeah, easily. And then you have a divinity invented for one circumstance of life. You can't discard that divinity, but then transformed for another circumstance of life. And it's amazing to see how they've been co-opted in my mind. All of that power has been channeled for a particular masculine good.
And that seems the more general. So the example I would use, like I'm constantly saying, like the religion, the dominant religion of the United States is mammonism. The religion is capitalism. Like we are in a situation where the people who worship the God of giving healthcare to poor people are almost guaranteed to vote against giving healthcare. Like the religion does not determine people's actions. People read the religion through.
So that's why my favorite book, and I'm trying to, I have it right here. My favorite book for things like this, and I use this in my class, is Michael Mann, The Sources of Social Power. And in this book, he separates society up into 4 parts: ideology, economy, military, and political systems. And he says that ideology can be religion, but it doesn't have to be religion. And ideology is the most powerful of the 4 because it can't be proved or disproved. And it gets people to choose against their own self-interest. And so today you see people, and the class I just taught on authoritarianism to write this book that I'm writing, I encourage my students to think of all of the ideals in the United States, like the Constitution and democracy and freedom and rights, as ideology. It is a religion. It is an ideology that gets people thinking in a certain way. Oh my God, you're taking away my rights. And people who think these are my rights use that as an ideology to take rights away from other people. It is the best way to morally turn that so that you can feel good about what it is you're doing. Whether it's against a Native American or an African coming over to enter chattel slavery, it doesn't matter. Or today with Jim Crow laws that are obviously still continuing around the United States in our prison complex. But so ideology is a huge part of how power is maintained. And I love this 4-part system of Michael Mann, because then it's not the economy or that drives everything, but economy and ideology. But then you want to add in the violent force as well. And then the political, whatever those backroom deals are, and how the next king becomes king, and all of those things swirling together, what creates this idea of power. And it's not let me down, this Michael Mann thing. The book is really hard, but it's wonderful. And it's changed my way of thinking about the ancient world. And I was introduced to it when I was a postdoc at Stanford. So it's been a buddy for a good 15, 16 years.
Well, I'm definitely going to pick this up. This sounds super interesting. I would say the same. I recently read The Dictator's Handbook, which is less academic. It's a popular book. And it kind of had the same effect for me of like changing the way I understood political power and things like that. Really.
I'll look into it.
It's a cool book. Okay, so I'm going to go to more questions. So Hannah asks, how do we consider any prehistoric history concrete when the evidence has centuries of manipulation? For example, past researchers omitting the homosexuality in Greece because it wasn't socially acceptable.
No, we still omit homosexuality because it's not socially.
Yeah.
That's only
There's a great.
These things are talked about, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. There's a great Facebook group. I think it's a Facebook group called like Sappho and Her Friend, where it's all examples of archaeologists being like, these 2 women were very good friends and they lived together and had a dog. And it's like, yeah.
I mean, I have the same problem with people going back into like Neankhnum and Khnum-Hotep, that they were homosexual lovers. We don't know what they were. And I don't expect the ancient Egyptians in an agricultural society to have been open about it, because that is an economically devastating thing to be. That you could probably be, if you're wealthy, on the side, but it's not something that you can display and show as your identity. The only reason we can do that today is because our economic model doesn't demand it. And so it's right. All right. But going back to the question, I can't take anything as given. So it blows everything up, everything that you look at has to be seen through an eye of the agenda of the person who is telling you. That means that you can be quite drawn, as I am, to social documents like Daryl Medina documents, where you think you're going to get more of the real story. Here's a divorce document, or here's a document of a woman saying he beat me and I am divorcing him. Or, this guy Paneb did these horrible things and we're going to have a trial against him. Even then, in those documents, you see people engaging in political persuasion, telling the story they need to tell. Think of the last human situation you were in which somebody broke up and they're like, he did these horrible things. And you know for a fact that he didn't, but you agree with your friend because your friend needs to know that he did those horrible things, and we all need to see our side of the story. Human beings are not good at absolute truth. We never were. We tell things through a lens of our own beliefs and persuasions and systems. And so that's why I think in terms of social systems, and I will never know what the actual truth was, this is coming back to what we were talking about, Christian, but you can at least get an idea of agenda and try to figure out what may have moved somebody towards one extreme or another. It makes it more possible if I think in systems, it makes it more possible for me to see individual agendas and to see possible untruths, mistruths, or self-denials within the ancient historical record. This is why archaeology is so incredibly important, like actual things and clothing and a tomb, and though tomb images are problematic as well.
It's a lens, social systems are a lens. The images on the tomb walls the texts are a lens, and we don't necessarily have to see things in like perfect exact focus ever to take another lens and look at it again and maybe build a clearer picture. We tend to be obsessed with proving things where I think if we really get down to it, that's not really what we're trying to do anyway.
No, I was talking to somebody about the Exodus. I'm like, it could easily have kernels of truth, but it doesn't need to have happened this way. But the storytelling needs it to have happened this way. But the process itself could have happened over generations and been this extraordinarily long, slow slog of pulling people out of a certain circumstance. But to tell the story, it has to be, a grand defeat to Pharaoh's army and God on their side. And that's the way we like to tell a story, but that's a different agenda.
Yeah, and that story is true in a way. It just might not be the literal facts on the ground. Okay, so another great question. When you say female kings, in quotes, female kings, trying to destroy the social construct that men in royalty have taken over, or is it meant to be a woman's empowerment statement? Why not just say queens?
Yeah, because the Egyptians use the word queen as an accompaniment, a sexual or ritual accompaniment of the king, and it connoted no power. When the Egyptians elevated a woman to this position or station formally, they called her king. And so I'm going to call her king. That's the way they choose to do it. I'm going to do it the same way. So all of these women, and that includes Cleopatra in the ancient texts, when you get down to it, the amount of lexicography that is assigned to her that is associated with kingship is many, and she's a king too, in my view. It doesn't have to just be the word nesut, though that's a very important one. But if the Egyptians call them that, that means something to me. And queen was different. So when Hatshepsut became king, she didn't use the word Hemet Nesut anymore. She dropped that, and she moved on to Nesut and Nebet Tawi and other things. And
she even suppressed it.
Yes.
She suppressed her connection by marriage.
And yes, her husband was of no use to her at that point. Only the father was of use. In the same way with Neferu Sobek, only the father was of use. And you need to suppress the husband, which can be so confusing to the historian. And we can look back at the historians trying to piece this stuff together in the 1920s and 1930s. And they're like, what the hell is going on with both of those two? Because the suppression is so extreme that you can't figure out who's the father and who's the husband. Same name. So at least same birth name. So it's complicated.
Yeah, it's confusing. I will just throw in there, just in case any part of that got a little too deep. The Egyptian phrase Hemet Nesu means wife of king, right? And that's the word that we normally translate as queen. So yeah, that I think there is just that like translation element of that question. It was like
well, and Christian, you know how literal this stuff gets. I mean, the word Hemet, what do you think it means literally?
I think it's probably related to the idea of a helper or servant. If I had to guess.
But then why does it have this little baskety thing and it's not using a different term, though it's the same transliteration?
I honestly don't know.
We don't know. And it could actually mean this weird thing with the jagged line. I mean, it could be like a vaginal receptacle container. She doesn't want to be that anymore when she takes on the formal power. And that's why taking on this power is associated with masculinizing. Whether she does it fully like Hatshepsut towards the end, or part ways like Nefer Sobek or Tawasret, is debatable, but they still have to layer on these masculine elements. And Nefertiti, if she became king as well, did it so well that we can't even find her. There is no Nefertiti of beauty left to be found. She truly did become that king.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I know one of my colleagues from Brown has argued that Manza, sorry, I want to make sure I plug her work. She recently published a paper that argued that vessel, that the Haim sign, is a metal bowl because the sky was associated with metal, because iron came in the form of meteorites. And I think even if whether or not you accept that, the metal bowl is often depicted as being filled with liquid, and the Egyptian gender notions included the idea of feminine as being sort of wet and male as being dry. So you definitely wouldn't want that if you're
in the container, the newt, you go into the sky. There's all of these contained elements that go into a vessel. And you could even go back to a pre-dynastic understanding of you're buried with all of these pots because you want beer jars, but you also want a feminine containment. In the absence of a coffin, you have all of these containers around you that you can kind of move into. And maybe it's a little too literal, but I don't know.
Well, they do sometimes call coffins eggs or vessels or things. So there is that notion of like a birth container, and it's tied to that for sure.
Yeah, most of coffin are feminine. Yeah,
that's interesting. At the beginning, you spoke briefly about Egyptian women leaders as patriarchal placeholders. That may not be word for word. Could you speak a little more about that?
So what I mean is that when a woman came to power, whether it be Merneith, who never took on the formal title of king, but was a king's mother, or Nefer Sobek, or Hatshepsut, or Nefertiti, or Tawasret, each one, and I'll leave Cleopatra out of it because she ended the line, but in each case, that woman is used to hold the line. And it's different in each case, right? So for Nefer Sobek, she's the last family member standing, and the dynasty ends with her, and they let her end it. And you can imagine like all of the courtiers who don't want to lose their positions, who enjoy the status quo, are like, what the hell do we do? Kings died, we didn't expect that. Oh my God. They let her rule while they can figure shit out. So they want to figure things out, and her, even if it's 4 years, even if it's 3 years, they can get some sort of a runway to figure out what they need to do next. And it's extraordinary that anybody did that at all, rather than letting the warlords just come in and take it. But this Bronze Age moment was not the way the Egyptians like to work. They wanted the status quo. The courtiers were this is so important. A woman does not become king alone. Whatever Sir Alan Gardner said, she doesn't just take it. And people are like, oh, the woman took it. Oh, mean lady. No, the woman takes power because the courtiers want her to take power. Nobody does anything alone. There's no such thing as one person coming in, whether you're Putin or Hitler, and saying, this is the way it's going to be. And everyone's like, yes, sir, you got to give to get in every circumstance. So
you'd have to have an Iron Man suit or something.
Yes, exactly. So if a woman is coming in, it's because people want and need that woman to come in. And in each and every circumstance, she is keeping the trains running on time. She is keeping the system going for them, keeping their jobs in place and their incomes rolling in until they figure it out and figure out what the next man is going to be. And for Hatshepsut, that's with, it's a more complicated and long story, but they still allow her to do it. They allow her to be regent, even though she's not the kid's mother. They allow her, or push her into it, for all we know, right? Maybe she's like a 16-year-old going, what the hell is going on? We don't know. But then they allow her to become king because there's competitors or what, we don't know what's happening, but she is allowed to do this. But as soon as that woman dies, they move in with another candidate. And in the same way that they're placeholders, there's also a pushback against the female power in just about every circumstance. So after each woman rules, people are like, holy crap, what was that? That was horrible. And instead of seeing the crisis as bringing the woman, they see the woman as bringing the crisis. Sure. And there is a pushback against female power in all of its forms. And Thutmose III, he hamstrings the God's wife of Amun position, and he goes around Hatshepsut's grandchildren if he married Neferure, which I think is a great possibility. And that's when he goes on his campaign of destruction against her and Neferure, though Neferure may have been earlier. Go figure that one out. But the placeholder it means that these women, as amazing as they seem, are nothing more than stations along the way of a larger patriarchy that changes nothing for the female power.
Yeah.
So
or even hurts it immediately afterwards.
No, it helps. It keeps the patriarchal authoritarian system.
Oh, I mean,
going.
it hurts female power immediately.
Oh, yes.
That, because of the pendulum effect. It doesn't, I remember wondering, like, how many times this might have happened, this female regent as placeholder, that we have absolutely no record of, because it worked, the line continued, and then the next king just obliterated all evidence that it happened.
That's why I started the book with Nitocris, because we have such good later stories about her. I'm like, it's too good. It fits the patterns too well. And there's too much damn female power at the end of the 6th dynasty. I mean, those women were badass. And even though Pepi I tries to move all of the females aside and gets new ones that he names after him, they still, even though they're not directly related to him, they still gain all of this power so fast. Maybe Nitocris is not one, but many, and is this memory of this super strong female royal power that they just couldn't move to the side. And I think something like that existed easily. We just have these legends of it. Yeah.
Okay, let me jump to a new one. So we're about at an hour. We have a couple more questions. I don't want to keep you here forever, Kara, because I know you have plenty of other things to do. Okay, so just a couple more questions. Is it possible that a masculine stance on rulership has hindered progress with the study of women as kings of Egypt? I love this question.
This is a tough one. What I think has hindered our study on the women as kings of Egypt is the expectation that when a woman occupies the position, it somehow changes the system, and that we can be proud of them, that they prove that Egyptians were different and embraced femininity, or that there was a matriarchy on the planet, or I think we don't see it for what it is. And I think we're only now in the last like 10, 15 years, really seeing what the patriarchy is and seeing a glimmer of what a post-patriarchy could be. And that's as a woman sitting at a computer terminal can do the same awesome shit that a man sitting at a computer terminal can do. In the same way that the people on whose land I am now standing, the Tongva Native Americans, the women had real representation in the Elders Council because they spearfished. That was the scarce resource. And the women could bring in that scarce resource to the same degree as the men, even when they were breastfeeding or pregnant or whatever. And so they had the same kind of power. We are now seeing that in our society. And for the first time, we're looking up and able to see this system more clearly for what it is. So everything has been colored by a lens of masculine power, whether it's a study of female kings or children and the value thereof, or farmland, economy, all of it has been colored. And I think we're now seeing things through different lenses of power. And the agricultural revolution, really, it's the agricultural revolution. It just destroyed everything. I guess we had to do it.
Terrible
right?
idea. Terrible idea.
That humanity had to do. And now we are seeing, the agricultural revolution led into the industrial revolution, which has led us to our planet destroying ways of smash and grab and patriarchy at all costs. Again, the big man gets to take down the whole forest, and there it is, and become rich, and we should glorify him. And it is a different kind of ideology, but that is the kind of thing that we are now, that is the focus of our political intent right now. The destruction of it on the one hand, and what we could possibly create on the other that could counter it.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I have nothing to add to that. I think that exactly matches what I would say. And it's like, it's the water in which we swim. It's like asking a fish what water tastes like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We did, yeah.
Where did the idea of royal inheritance female line come from? Was it an attempt to understand a confusing system of inheritance, i.e. create continuity through bloodline, even if non-existent?
So this brings up a really touchy problem called the heiress theory. And Christian, you know about this, right? That there was this theory that, and I think obviously it's been refuted successfully, but this idea that you had to have female blood to become king, and this is in many books that people read, and they assume, particularly about female rule, and they assume that this was necessary. Now, the refutation of the heiress theory, I think, was a little too strong, because you can see in the 18th dynasty or the 12th dynasty that you have certain kings being chosen as kings because of their male line, obviously, but also because of their female bloodline. You get a whole choice for the female bloodline if you're coming from a harem construct, right? And I believe in using the word harem, by the way. That's another point. But so the mother of the king is important, and we have no idea how that worked in choosing the next king and what those backroom deals were like in those political arenas of power as people are trying to figure out which family is going to be the best to pull a king from. And if there's competition among families, then incest is going to win the day, because then you just don't even have to bother with which in-laws you're bringing in versus others. So I think that female lineage is more important than we make out. And I think that we need to bring that back into discussion. So there's another dissertation right there for whoever wants to do it. Take on the heiress theory and do it in a more nuanced way, so that you're not refuting a simplistic understanding, but telling us how this might have worked in a longue durée scheme of things, different in the 18th dynasty than the 19th dynasty, for example, and see what one could do with it.
Yeah, cool. That's a great question. Okay, so I think we've covered all of our questions that we had for you. Is there anything that you want to add before we go?
No, I think I'm good. This has been super fun, and it's always astounding to me how much the ancient world is incredibly relevant, and how much it brings up modern politics. And I would just, for anybody watching who thinks that I bring too much politics into the ancient world, I would say that we risk treating ancient Egypt as this precious, fetishized thing that is somehow alien-like and different when we do that. If we treat it with such particularism, then it becomes something it's almost a racist way of looking at Egypt, as opposed to seeing it as ourselves. And I think that we can use any ancient study as a longue durée of humanity, its reactions to crisis, its reactions to power. And that's how I like to move my work forward.
Yeah, I mean, if we don't allow it to be relevant to our modern situation, we're basically arguing that what we're doing has no practical value, which is pretty problematic if we want to keep doing it, because we live in an extremely capitalistic society that measures things in terms of dollars. So yeah, that's really important. Well, yeah, I'm glad you're doing that. I totally agree. I can't really push back against it, because I'm also a fan of, bringing the ancient world into, direct conversation with like our current situation. And that's kind of what Sasa is trying to do too. The whole point of Sasa is to show that these things are relevant. So that's what first got me involved with Sasa, is that, well, for one thing, the immediate practicality is that like my future in this field depends on people sort of recognizing that this thing has value, because we are in a situation where there are far too many people, like me, early career scholars, than there are, chairs for us to fill. So that's an immediate practical problem, but also just the incredible value that this has, the way it can enrich your life without being an ancient world scholar. So that's something that I'm trying to do. I'm supposed to plug myself right now, Kara. That's why I'm saying all these things. So if anyone is interested in my Coptic class or the online ancient Egyptian language stuff that I do, I'm sure Lauren can put a link to my website. And Kara, I know you do tons of stuff online. Like you do your Facebook streams all the time.
I
so
kind
tell
of
us about that stuff.
I started writing, and when I was doing the Facebook lives, like once a week, twice a week, I was teaching. And so I was in a speaking frame of mind, and it was more natural. Then I went into writing, and I'm trying to get a book out, and I found I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the two things at the same time. So I stopped, but I'm going to start teaching again soon. So who knows what's going to happen with the Facebook lives and things like that. So maybe I'll get back out there and start talking to people again.
Well, that sounds just great. And I can watch them. And everyone who's watching this should find Kara on Facebook. Lauren wants us to put links.
Yeah, I have. It's on many. There's Facebook, and it's on YouTube, and I post it to Twitter too. So it's out there.
Yeah.
Okay. I have all the
Well, thank you very much for being here. We sure appreciate it. And hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for listening.